All right, so a little bit about myself before I kind of jump into the content. So my name is Justin Blietz. I currently serve as the Director of Culture and Climate Transformation for the Cedar Rapids Community School District. So that's my primary role. I'm also a licensed trainer in restorative practices through the International Institute of Restorative Practices, and am a qualified administrator for the Intercultural Development Inventory. So through that work, I've been fortunate enough to work with a lot of schools and districts across the country and really looking at integrating their equity work, restorative work, trauma-informed work into their already existing multi-tiered system of supports. And so a lot of times folks are saying, we've been doing PBIS for 7 years and we're not really getting the results we want, and we really want to shift to restorative practices, or we want to, do this in a more trauma-informed way. What does that look like? Do we just have to scrap everything we've been doing? And the answer is absolutely not. But what does that integration piece look like, and how do we meld those worlds together? And so that's kind of what I've been able to support a lot of schools and districts with, and what we'll be able to talk a little bit about today. So our topic is creating a trauma-sensitive culture through restorative practices. Raise your hand if you've had experience or familiar with restorative practices, have done some of that work. All right, so this is not a new topic for many of you. Awesome. So our objectives for today are going to be, we want to be able to describe the rationale behind restorative practices and how they differ from traditional practices. And so I think this is really important for me, at least. What I've seen in my experience, when I go to connect with a school who wants to engage in this work and they say, yeah, we've been dabbling with restorative practices, and we go in, and typically what that means is they've heard about restorative practices. They want to have less suspensions. And so when kids get in a fight, they bring them into a room and try to have them talk about it. And it usually blows up and is super ineffective. But that's kind of like the gist of what most folks where I see restorative practices happening, what that looks like. So we want to be able to understand the rationale behind it, why it works, why we would want to do it, what the kind of foundational pieces are. We'd want to be able to understand and demonstrate a continuum of restorative practices. So what do those look like from a tier 1 level all the way to a tier 3 level? And understand how that can fit within a healthy MTSS and align with the current culture and climate work that you're doing already in your systems. So we're not going to write necessarily, because it's kind of hard to write when you don't have anything like a table in front of you. But if you could just reflect and then turn to a partner, I'd like you to think about what are 3 values that are really, really important to you that you try to carry with you into your work each day as you're interacting with students, interacting with colleagues, interacting with your families and in your personal life. But what are 3 of your core values that you carry with you each day? Let's go ahead and take a couple minutes to turn to a partner and have that conversation. All right, I hear the conversation's wrapping up a little bit. So thanks for engaging in that conversation. And I think it's really, really important for several reasons to center on our values frequently. But importantly in this conversation, I think it's super important because we want in our systems to be able to be very clear with our constituents what it is we believe in and what it is we value. And then we want to be able to have practices that align to that. And so raise your hand if you could right now share your district's mission statement. Okay, so see a handful of people or your organizations. So I think that's not uncommon, right? We have these things because it's something that we're supposed to do. We know that when you get a handbook or when you walk into a building, you're supposed to have a poster hanging up that says, this is our mission. But when only a handful of us in this space know our district's mission, and again, no judgment, please don't hear this as judgment. What we know is that it's not very likely that we're aligning our practices each day to our values and to our mission, and living that out and acting consistently across our system within that mission. So we really want to be able to identify what our values are, what our mission is. So because formally we might do some things, we might say, yeah, we have X, Y, and Z going on in our districts, but informally, the things that happen every single day, if people aren't clear about what our values are and what our mission is and what our beliefs are, it's really, really unlikely that we're going to act within those. And so it's kind of like the speed limit, right? We know when I was just driving up here today, I know that the speed limit is 70. That's what I'm supposed to do. But I won't tell you how fast I was going, but it wasn't 70, right? So I wasn't necessarily what actually happens and what's supposed to happen aren't in alignment unless we're crystal clear on what should be going on. So if you struggle explaining what your system's rationale is and their beliefs, it might be because it's intuitive, it's based on customs. We've never had to explain it. We don't have enough time to start engaging in conversations about values because we're always jumping to what's the next thing we're going to do, or it's in our implicit framework. And so what we want to do is we want to make really explicit what our values and beliefs are, and then we want to have practices in a framework that aligns to those pieces. And so I think to myself, and maybe this is you don't have to raise your hand on this, but this is the analogy that I would give. Right now, Christmas is coming up, right? We're transitioning to the holiday season, and I take my daughter to Target, and we're in the toy section, and she bounces from thing to thing saying, "Oh, Daddy, can I get this? Daddy, can I get this? I want this from Santa. I want this, I want this, I want this," right? And I think about our systems, especially in a time like this. Who's struggling with student behavior right now in student social emotional needs? Yeah, a lot of people, right? Like that's a need right now. And when that happens and we're feeling overwhelmed, what's the first thing we do? Oh my gosh, we could do restorative practices. Oh my gosh, we could get this SEL curriculum. Oh my God, did you see Second Step? This other district uses Second Step. We could do that, right? And it's not about what are our values and how can we find something that's aligned with our values and the beliefs of our system. It's what's the next shiny thing we can get. And then we just, have this proliferation of programs. And then teachers are like, what in the hell are you doing to me? You're giving me 30 things to do this year, and we're not even doing any of them well. So what we want to do is be able to clearly articulate our values and then say, what is a framework or a system or structure that aligns to our values and not the other way around. So when we think about the theoretical framework of restorative practices, what are the values that the restorative practices are aligned in? What are the beliefs that we would have if restorative practices were a good fit for us? Because again, we shouldn't do it because the AEA tells us to, or we shouldn't do it because another district's doing it. We should do it because we want to find a framework that aligns to our values and our beliefs in the way that we want to operate. So the theoretical framework is this. We believe in restorative practices in a whole child approach. We believe that our job isn't to show up and be a physics teacher or a math teacher or a reading teacher. Our job is to show up and be a teacher of students, right? Like we believe in a whole child approach. We believe in teaching behaviors. We believe in teaching social emotional competencies. And we also believe in teaching our content, but we're there to teach students, not content. We believe in the importance of relationships. So we know that for learning to happen, any significant learning to happen, we have to have relationships, not only between teacher and student, but between students. And we're going to have intentional practices that create strong relationships. We believe in a whole school approach. So we should all be aligned in the building. It shouldn't be in this classroom, this happens, and in this classroom, this happens, and in this classroom, this happens, but we believe in a whole school approach. We believe in positive discipline. And we believe in a trauma-sensitive learning environment. So we know the impact that trauma has on students, and we're aware of that, and we act accordingly. And then we believe in mindfulness practice. We believe in slowing down and actually solving problems and not just running around putting out fires and running around with our head cut off. But we believe in slowing down and saying, what's the root cause? How do we collaborate and work together to solve this? So I'm going to read on this next slide 7 values that are aligned to restorative practices. And I want you to think to yourself, just on each one, rate 1 to 5, how much that value aligns to your personal values or beliefs. Again, no judgment. You don't have to share this, but just think to yourself, does this align to my values or not? So the first core value of restorative practices, the true self of everyone is good, wise, and powerful. So it might be easy to look at your colleague who you came to this conference with and be like, yeah, I believe that. They're good, wise, and powerful. Think about the person on the news who just committed a really nasty crime. Is that person at their true core, do you believe that person is good, wise, and powerful? Politics, we don't need to take sides, but think about whatever side you're on the aisle. Think about the person on the other side of the aisle. And do you think that person at their core is good, wise, and powerful? So again, no judgment here, but where are your values in alignment? Because this framework, these are the values that this framework is built on. The world is profoundly interconnected. I can't be well if the community is not well. So it's not about individualism, it's about collectivism. It is about the health of the community, not the health of me. So my needs don't take precedent over everyone else. If a problem happens in the classroom, it takes a whole community to heal. Everybody's impacted and we need to heal together. It's not just about one person. We're all interconnected. All humans have a deep desire to be in good relationship. So we're all going to struggle and we all want to, no matter how much our actions might say otherwise, we have a desire to be in good relationship. And when we're not, there's some need missing that's not being addressed. All humans have gifts and everyone's needed for what they bring. So if you're a teacher, think about that student who you go home every night and you tell your spouse about, I need a glass of wine. This kid gave me such a headache. And think about, what is the gift that student brings and what would be missing from your classroom if that student was there? Because everybody's needed for what they bring and every student has gifts. Everything we need to make positive change is already here. So we talk a lot about what we don't have. We don't have staffing. We don't have funding. We don't have this. Do we believe when we pull the community together around a common problem that we have everything we need to create change? And then last, human beings are holistic. So I am not the worst thing that I've done. We are all more than the worst thing we've done. We're all we're all very complex beings, and we're holistic. So think about those things. And again, my job isn't to make you believe those things. We all have our own values and beliefs. My job is to tell you, when we're looking at this framework called Restorative Practices, this framework was designed around these values. And if we're not in alignment with these values, then this framework might seem like a stretch for you. It might say, I don't know if this is right for me. This makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. If you said like 5 to all these, then you might be like, hell yeah, let's do this. This is awesome. Let's go. So that's that context there. When we're thinking about trauma-informed values and beliefs, this is maybe something you've seen throughout this week, but thinking about safety, empowerment, voice and choice, collaboration and mutuality, peer support, these are all things that are promoted through a restorative framework. So one way that we can look at this when we're thinking about how we're approaching our session today with each other is to think about when we talked about those values and beliefs and what we think should be happening in a social emotional behavior system, is to think about how do we approach when those values don't align with us. So some of those things that I said when we're looking at cultural differences or beliefs, when I said all human beings are good, wise, and powerful, if that didn't resonate with you, when you hear that, do you judge that difference and say, no, I don't believe that, I'm going to shut down? Do you minimize and say, well, yeah, we might be different on that, but we have a lot of other things in common, and minimize that difference? Or do we try to understand those differences and see where we can align? So I'd encourage you to kind of think through this as we're going through that today. I've talked a lot. I want you to turn to your partner and have just a brief conversation, 2 minutes, digest what we talked about. What's resonated, what hasn't resonated, what are you feeling like right now? Take 2 minutes to have a conversation with your partner. All right, if we could go ahead and come back in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Well, aren't you all just a compliant bunch? I love it. Wouldn't it be awesome if classrooms worked like that? How many times do you have to do that in your second grade class? All right, so we've talked about the values that drive restorative practices. Now I kind of want to talk about the science that drives restorative practices. So what is this rooted in? What's the evidence behind it? What's the research behind it? Why does it work? So at its core, restorative practices work because we believe that all behavior is driven by feelings and emotion. Agree or disagree? All behavior is driven by feelings and emotion. Okay. So a lot of this research was driven by Sylvan Tompkins and Daniel Nathanson, and it's rooted in this affect psychology. And so what we believe and what we think is that all humans, although we're very different and complex people, all humans have the same 9 affects. So anytime a stimuli is delivered, one of these 9 affects is triggered, and they happen on a range. So 2 of those are positive on the range from enjoyment to joy or interest to excitement. There's one neutral affect, which is kind of like a reset trigger, which is surprise or startle. And then the rest are what we would call negative affects. So what we believe is that human beings, what drives us, our blueprint for motivation, is that we want to experience positive affect, and we're going to do things that make us feel good. We want to avoid negative affect, and we also believe that we're most motivated when we can freely express affect. I want to differentiate, though, between what I mean when I say affect versus feelings versus emotion, because I think these are three things that oftentimes we use interchangeably, but in this regard are different. And so an affect, we don't have any control over. That is something that an input is given and that's triggered, and we don't have any control over it. It's not something that's driven by experience. It's not something that's different by person to person. It is just a biological piece of who we are. However, when that affect is triggered, the awareness of that affect being triggered creates a feeling. So we talk a lot about feelings and building that emotional vocabulary, that describing our feelings. And then we also know when certain feelings are triggered based on our experiences and what's happened when those feelings have been triggered in our past, emotions come up. And so that's where it is scripted and it's a little bit different. So our emotions, we could experience the same thing, have the same affect triggered, recognize that feeling, but based on our life experiences, our emotions might be different because we have different scripts within us based on what we've experienced when those feelings have been triggered within us. So everybody loves pictures of babies, right? Everybody will feel happy now. So all of this research was done on babies. That's where this originated at, right? And so the babies would receive a stimulus and they would look at the baby's reaction. What we could see is across the world, babies would have similar reactions based on the affect that was triggered. So we see the interest, excitement, surprise, startle, enjoyment, joy, anger, rage. And one that I really want to focus on is this shame and humiliation. And so what we see is humans, regardless of age, whether they're a baby or an adult, often have the same biological response to shame. We see our shoulders shrug, we see our gaze go down. We often feel some things happen within us where we might feel hot inside. Some of those things happen. Now, any Brené Brown people out here? Okay. So I'm going to ask you to kind of pivot, because I know Brené Brown talks a lot about shame, and Brené Brown's really cool. I like her too. She's awesome. But the way in affect psychology, how we talk about shame is a little bit different than how Brené Brown might talk about shame. So just try to push those thoughts aside. So in affect psychology, shame is anything that impedes a positive affect. So think about you're in the hallway as a teacher and it's passing time, and the bell rings and two kids are walking to class and they're late to class and they're having a great time. They're having a positive conversation. They're enjoying each other's company. And you say, hey guys, let's get to class. Now, would anybody say that you just shamed that student with your context of maybe what you're previously thinking shame is? That to me doesn't seem like a shaming thing, right? Like I think of shame as like, you idiot, what are you thinking, right? Like that's not how we're thinking shame. Shame is impeding a positive affect. So they're feeling good. We interrupt that positive affect, and then that shame affect is triggered. And so the purpose of shame is to let us know that there's been an impediment to our ongoing positive feeling. So it's inherently punishing. Our positive feeling is stopping. And what we know is that no one can think clearly in the moment of shame. And so we always need to recognize that it's impossible for someone to think clearly when that shame affect has been triggered. I also want to talk about how we separate shame and guilt, because those are two separate things that I think are important for us to talk about. So shame is when we evaluate our whole self against a particular standard, whereas guilt is where we're able to evaluate our specific behavior against a particular standard. So if we think about, I'm an 8th grade math teacher and I'm handing back math tests, and I give Elizabeth her math test back, and there's a big F on her math test. If Elizabeth is shame prone, what she would say to herself is, gosh, I am such an idiot. I'm so stupid. I suck at math. I'll never be good at math because I'm dumb. She's evaluating herself against that standard of the math class. A guilt prone student would be able to say, if Elizabeth was guilt prone, she'd be able to say, that was really stupid that I stayed up all night talking to my boyfriend on the phone. Like, I know he's super cute and it's really hard not to talk to him. But when I stayed up all night talking to him on the phone, I didn't study for math test, and now I failed the math test. She's able to recognize and separate her behavior from herself and recognize that it's the behavior that triggered that. Now, what we need to know is that a lot of this is dictated by language that's used with students, both at home and in person. So when we talk through that with students, it's important we are always trying to separate the deed from the doer, separating the student from the actual behavior that's driving that, because over time, students who are called, lazy or disrespectful begin to internalize that's who I am. And I begin to evaluate my whole self against the standard of what it means to be good versus being able to separate my behavior and what I'm doing as not aligning to the standard. So this is some more research from Nathanson. He says that when that shame affect is triggered, which it is for everybody multiple times a day, right? Like our positive affect is impeded multiple times throughout the day. Human beings have 4 places that they'll go on what we call this compass of shame. So some folks, when that shame affect is triggered, they'll withdraw. They'll isolate themselves. They'll run and hide. Think about those students who maybe in the cafeteria, they've had negative experiences because kids are bullying them, kids, are picking on them, making comments. And so what do? They go hide in the bathroom during lunch because they want to withdraw. They don't want to be in that space where that negative affect is triggered frequently. Some students will avoid. So we're like that denial, we'll try to avoid that feeling of shame being triggered by doing things like using drugs, using alcohol. A lot of times we'll see this in the class clown. I can't be really successful in class, but I can be really good and make this feeling go away if I can tell jokes and get kids to laugh at me, because then that re-triggers that positive affect. So we see avoidance there. We see students who will attack self. I'm so stupid. I'm an idiot. We'll see, they'll put themselves down. We even see this most extreme in self-harming behaviors. And then this is probably most prominent because it's the one that impacts us the most, when students attack others. So when I hand Elizabeth that F that she got on her test, instead of, being able to be aware and separate herself from behavior, she'll look and, well, if you weren't such a crappy teacher, I wouldn't have got an F, right? She's attacking others instead of being able to kind of reflect on that process. And so what Nathanson was saying is we go to one of these 4 places. And so I think to myself, what does this look like and why is this important? Well, at home, it's important for me to know that when my wife gets mad at me, instead of dealing with the problem productively, what do? I go downstairs into the basement. I might have a beer and go watch ESPN. Right? I'm withdrawing from the situation. As a teacher, I can think of situations where this would have been really helpful for me. I was a science teacher. Hey, I have a science friend partner here, Mrs. Borton. What's up? But I think to myself on one experience when I was teaching science, it was after the weekend. It was a Monday. We were going to do a lab. I had went out and I had bought all these materials for the lab. I was super pumped up to do it. Get to class, get everything set up, come early that day. The kids start coming in, introduce the lesson, and what happens? Kids start throwing materials. They're not engaged. They don't care. Now, for me, I was super high, right? Excited, experiencing positive affect. That positive affect was interrupted by kids throwing things, not paying attention. That shame affect was triggered. And what did I do? Attack others. These kids, they don't care. Gosh, why don't they care about their education? Oh, they're so disrespectful, blah, 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 right? Now, I could have just stayed there and sat with that, or I could have said, okay, what's going on here, Justin? You're feeling shame right now, and that shame is triggering you to attack others. Let's be a little more productive in this and reflect on this and figure out what's going on. And so it's a way that this compass of shame can help us not only reflect with ourselves, but maybe have conversations with others when they say, this kid can't be in my class anymore. He's this and that, and I need him out of my class, to say, okay, let's talk a little bit more about what's going on. And, what role might your feelings be playing in this situation, and how can we more productively navigate through this? Turn to your partner and talk about, where do you typically go? I think we all go to all these places, right? But I think we all have a primary space that we typically go when that shame affect is triggered for us. Turn to a partner and talk about where you typically go when your shame affect is triggered on this compass of shame. All right, so it's always interesting to reflect on that. I really like thinking through that, because I found that's been really helpful for me, thinking through that compass of shame in a lot of my personal interactions and interactions at work. So some of the research that really drives the work of restorative practices, talk about Breathweights Hypothesis. Breathwaite was an Australian criminologist, and the focus of his research, which I think is interesting and would be helpful for us, is rather than focusing on why criminals are criminals and why they do bad things, he flipped it and said, why do 95% of people do the right thing most times when they show up? Like, why are people inherently good, and why do they typically do the right things? And through his research, he talked a lot about the more that we are able, like we talked about earlier, to separate the deed from the doer, that we're able to impact society more positively. And so the thing about restorative practices that we want to focus on is, with restorative practices, they allow us to demonstrate that something is unacceptable. So the act is unacceptable because we're not meeting an expectation or a standard, but we're still valuing and demonstrating, acknowledging that intrinsic worth of the human being in our spaces. And we're very intentional about it and have practices set up to do that. You talked about this idea too of stigmatizing shame versus reintegrative shame. And so that stigmatizing shame, when something happens, we push the offender out of the community and label them. And that offender now internalizes themselves as a bad person who's committed harm or a crime. That label might follow them. And when they don't feel a sense of belonging, because we know a core need of all humans is to feel a sense of belonging. When I don't feel a belonging in the space like the classroom or my community, I'm going to find belonging somewhere. And so what do we often do is we see those folks find belonging in a criminal subculture. And so what we want to do instead, and I think, when we think about our school systems and our criminal justice systems, that's how both of them are set up, right? I do something bad, I get arrested, I get labeled, a felon, and then I am not able to get a job. I'm not able to access all of these things. And so what do? I don't fit in. Nobody wants me. I don't have any value or worth. I got to find somewhere where I can find value and worth, and who's going to give that to me? And so folks will always seek to find a place to belong. And often that's where we, maybe wouldn't want them to belong. Rather, we want to try to have a system set up that utilizes what we would call reintegrative shame. So again, we express disapproval, but don't push the offender out of the community. So this shame rejects the act, but not the person, and allows for folks to be reintegrated back. And so when we think about how are our systems set up, we are a community, right? Like that's what all restorative practices are rooted in. As a classroom, as a school, we are a community. So are our systems set up when somebody does something that violates our norms? Is our system set up to do this, to push them out and label them? Oh, that's an IEP kid. That's a behavior focused kid. That's a tier 3 kid. Yeah, we just, it's not safe when they're in the building. We got to get them out of here. Is that our goal, to label and push out? Or is our goal to say, yeah, this was not a safe thing that happened. How can the community come together to support this student? So anybody who's impacted, anybody who's involved, how do we identify the resources, supports, and skills that are needed to allow that student to be successful in our space? So when we're thinking about shame, knowing that shame affect will be triggered, for all of us in this room right now, that shame affect has been triggered for us several times today. We've experienced shame. How do we respond when students are experiencing shame, so we're not having to push students out when they go to that attack other space on that compass of shame? We don't have to respond by saying, you can't be here anymore, you don't belong, we're going to push you out. Well, what we can do is we can listen to what students have to say. We can be present without trying to problem solve, which I find for me as an educator is really, really hard, because I've been socialized and programmed to be the person who has all the answers, right? So instead of, sitting, well, this is what you should do and this is what you should do, how do I just stop, put a question out there, an open-ended question, and just listen, allow the student to reflect. Allow students to reflect on what's caused that feeling of shame, acknowledge and validate those feelings. So a lot of times we'll say, oh my gosh, why are you making such a big deal out of that? That's not a big deal. That happens to everybody. Instead, validate. That must be really hard. It sounds like you're feeling really frustrated. That's really hard when you're feeling frustrated. And then encourage them to talk about that experience. All right, so relationships. Did anybody say when they talked about their values that they try to bring with them share something about relationships or connection or belonging? Raise your hand if you shared something related to that in your values. So I think as educators, that's something we believe is important, right? We believe in the value of relationships. How many of you get really tired of coming to like conferences like this or professional development sessions and have people say, just build relationships, right? It gets super annoying. Like I remember like having tough kids when I was a teacher, and the principal would be like, it's all about relationships. I'm like, well, yeah, no shit, you come build a relationship with them. The problem is, right, is we know relationships are important, but everybody responds to different actions differently. Relationship means something different to all of us, and we all have different skill sets. So for some people, like I think about one of my buddies, like we can go out and like he will just be chatting up everybody. I'm like, oh, how do you know that person? Oh, I don't, I just met him, right? Like it's just inherent natural to connect and go talk with people. And there's some people who like that's just not for them, right? Like I'll do what you tell me to do, but it's really hard for me to strike up a conversation. It's really hard for me to connect. And we're really great at saying, as a math teacher, here's these 15 different instructional strategies you should use. But how often do you go to a PL session where it's like, here's these 15 really great relationship building strategies that you can use, and we're going to practice these together and we're going to support each other with those, right? We don't have a framework to build relationships, to build community, but we always say that that's the most important thing. We spend all of our time talking about instructional strategies. We never talk about relational and community building strategies, but yet we say that's the foundation for what we need to do if we want to be successful. So how do we do that? Well, we have to interweave restorative practices into every part of what we do. So restorative practices, let me be very clear, is not a discipline strategy. It is not a way to respond to student discipline. It can be. We can respond in a restorative way when students do things that don't align to our values. But restorative practices are how I greet somebody when they walked in the door today. Restorative practices is how the custodian interacts with the cafeteria worker in our building. It's how students approach an adult when they come into the space. It's how an adult approaches a student when they come into the space. Restorative practices are everything that we do. It's how we communicate. It's how we interact. It is not simply a way of when students do something that doesn't align to our behavior matrix. It's not the way we respond. That's a small part of what we do. Now, when we think about that, though, with restorative justice, when harm has been caused, it is a strategy that we can use. So what does that look like? How is it different from our traditional way of doing things? Restorative practices focuses on the community and the relationship, not the rules. How many of you have a rule that says you can't wear hats in school? Okay. I'm not saying that rule is right or wrong. Have that rule. That's not for me to decide. But what I would be more concerned about when a student says, I'm not taking my hat off, is to say, how are people in relationships violated? Not, you won't take your hat off or you have a hat on and that's against the school rule. What's the purpose, right? We're here to collaborate, to get an education. And if that rule is not allowing the students to get their education, or it's creating something that's unsafe, then let's address that. But let's talk about how people in relationships are violated. Let's not just say, well, it's the rule. I don't know why we have it. Yeah, it's a stupid rule, but I got to enforce it. Like that doesn't make sense, right? When we think about justice, with restorative justice, it's not about establishing guilt. How many times do we do investigations? We got to figure out who's wrong. Whose fault was it? We got to find the one person who was bad, and then, oh boy, they're going to get it, right? Like that's not what this is about. We got to figure out if people in relationships were violated, then what are the needs and obligations to repair the harm? And that's going to be different, right? So I think what's really challenging for this, and I'll be honest, it challenges me because I came from a place in a space that said we have to have a T-chart that says cursing, 30-minute detention, elopement, hour detention, fighting, 3-day suspension, right? And it's like very black and white. But if we're shifting to, it's not about the school and the rules, it's about the people and relationships in the space, it's about the community, my needs are going to be different than someone else's needs when something takes place. And so if somebody steals a cell phone, if somebody curses somebody out, I'm not saying we don't respond to that. By no means would I ever say like that is acceptable and we should do that. We never lower the bar, never lower the standard. But what I'm saying is the needs and obligations are going to be different, and it should be articulated by the person who's been harmed. So if I've been harmed, I should have a seat at the table and I should be able to say, this is how I was impacted, and this is what I think needs to happen to get things right with us and to be able to move forward. It shouldn't just be some arbitrary thing that happens to me when a rule is broke. I think the biggest thing here is that when I see traditional discipline, a student does something in a classroom, the teacher sends them out of the classroom, and some person down the hall in an office says, oh, they get to decide everything, right? They don't even hear necessarily who was impacted, what harm it had. It's very much just about the rule, and they make a decision. Who doesn't get a voice in our traditional system? The victim, right? The person who's been most impacted typically never gets a voice. And so someone steals a cell phone, they get suspended for 3 days, they come back, and the victim's like, wait, what? They're back? And I didn't know this what happened. I didn't know why they're gone. I didn't know now that they're back. Are they going to hurt me again? Are they going to do something again? They've never had a seat at the table to say, this is how this impacted me. This is how I felt when this happened. And this is what I would like to have happen in order for things to be right and for me to be comfortable moving forward. So I think that's what's most important, is we always want to give a voice to the person who's been harmed or the people who've been harmed. Because even I think about folks who often don't have a seat at the table. Let's say a fight breaks out in the cafeteria or in the hallway. And if we're doing restorative justice light, we might say, let's bring these two kids together and let's have them problem solve and talk about why the fight happened. Well, what about that kid who was just minding their own business, walking to class and got shoved up against a locker in the middle of the fight? Was like, God, I hate coming to this school. It's not safe. I got to watch my back every time I walk down the hallway because I never know if a fight's going to break out. How do we create a structure where that student has a seat at the table to say, hey, I know you weren't even mad at me, but this is how what happened impacted me, and this is what I need in order for us to move forward, right? Bringing everybody to the table who's been impacted by whatever harm's been caused. I think it's really important. All right, so another pair share here. I want you to think about who has been the most influential person in your life, the person who's had the greatest impact on you. And I want you to think of one word you would use to describe that person. And then I want you to think about when that person challenged you, when you did something, when you weren't living up to, you weren't being the best version of yourself, you weren't living up to the standards you've set for yourself. How did that person respond? So this could be a coach that you had growing up, could be a colleague or a boss you have now, could be a parent. Think about that. And then I want you to turn to a partner, share to the degree that you feel comfortable. The one thing I would invite you to share, at least at minimum, is the word that you use to describe that person. If you don't want to share who that person is, you don't have to. If you're open to that, go ahead and do that. But at least share the word that you use to describe that person. Let's go ahead and take a couple minutes to have that conversation. I always like having this conversation when you talk about triggering a positive affect, thinking about that really influential person on you that always, right, makes you happy talking about that person. So as we're going through the next couple slides, what I would invite you to do is to think about that person that you just talked about, that person who was really influential on you, and think about where they fall and how they relate to the next couple slides we're going to talk through. So the fundamental hypothesis of restorative practices is that human beings are happier, more productive, more cooperative, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when people in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. We all agree with that? If I'm a building principal, I am happier when folks at central office involve me in decisions and do things with me rather than to me or for me. If I'm a teacher, I'm happier when my supervisor, my principal, involves me in the process and does things with me rather than to me or for me. And if I'm a student, I'm happier when my teacher does things with me rather than to me or for me. Seems pretty easy, right? So how do we quantify that, or how do we look at that maybe in a different way? So this is a social discipline window that kind of contextualizes that. So on the left side, from low to high, we have control, limit setting, or discipline. And then on the bottom, from low to high, we have support, encouragement, or nurturing. So if somebody was really high on control and discipline, but low on support, we would say that that person does things primarily to people or acts in maybe a punitive way. So we think of maybe the example I gave earlier, the behavior matrix where we says, if you do this, then this happens to you. If you do this, then this happens to you, right? There's no context to it. I'm not necessarily providing any support. I'm saying I have the rule, but I'm not providing any support when that rule is broken. I'm just saying there's going to be this consequence that I'm giving. Think about students vaping in the bathroom, and I call the SRO or and say, you're going to get a ticket because you were vaping. Or I say, you're going to be suspended for 3 days because you were vaping. I'm not necessarily providing any support like lining that student up with substance abuse resources. I'm not identifying why that student felt the need to vape in the bathroom, whether it was trying to fit in because they were trying to feel a sense of belonging, whether or not that they were feeling depressed and that's a way for them to cope with some of those feelings that they're experiencing. It was all about, you broke a rule, you get a consequence. So high control, low support. The bottom, if we're low on control, low on discipline, we might say that that person is not necessarily doing things for anyone. They're neglectful. I hope that we don't have many folks in this space. I can think of a time when I was in high school and I had a teacher who was close to retirement. And I remember walking into his class every day, and he'd be sitting at his desk, and he'd be reading the newspaper, and there'd be a worksheet at the corner of the desk, and you could take it if you wanted to, and if you didn't want to, you didn't necessarily have to. And everybody just passed the class, and it was kind of one of those things. That might be neglectful. Now, I don't see that happening often, and I hope that doesn't happen often at all. But where I do see neglectful happening in a way that's not intentional, I think, and I used to say this with a lot of new to the profession teachers, but I think this is just a lot of teachers in general, right? We're experiencing it right now. You come back from COVID year and kids were remote, and kids are struggling to transition back to what it means to be in school and learn routines and procedures. And you've tried every trick in your playbook, and you've gone to your instructional coach and said, I don't know what to do, I need help. And you've gone to your principal and you said, I don't know what to do, I need help. And the behaviors just keep mounting, and you're writing referrals all day, and you say, you know what? I don't know what to do. I give up. I give up. I've tried everything that I've got and nothing's working. And you just kind of let things go, not because you don't care, because you're just overwhelmed. You don't know what to do, right? And so it's not necessarily an intentional thing. So I think a lot of times when we talk about that neglectful piece, we think like, oh, why would you do that? I don't think it's always, intentional. It's a lot of just feeling overwhelmed. I really want to talk about this 4 box though, this permissive box, because I think a lot of times when we think about trauma-informed practices, when we think about restorative practices, this is where a lot of people perceive these practices landing, right? So high support and nurturing and encouragement with low expectations. So we're in a building and our suspension numbers are high and our disproportionality numbers are high, and we don't know what to do. So what are we going to do when a student curses at a teacher or threatens a peer? We're going to say, hey, buddy, I know you're really frustrated, but we can't do that. Let's try again and let's go back to class, right? We pat them on the back. We might offer some support, hey, I know you're feeling overwhelmed, but there's really no discipline or limit setting or control. And that's not a space where people feel safe, right? Students don't feel safe. Students need predictability. They need boundaries. They need expectations. I think that's something we've probably heard over and over again in this space. What we never want to do with restorative practices, and please don't misuse restorative practices in this way, we never want to lower our standard for students. Just because a student's been impacted by trauma, just because a student's struggling and having a hard time, doesn't mean that they're not 100% capable of achieving greatness. And nobody does well when we lower our standards for kids, right? So just because these students have experienced these things, we don't want to lower the standards. What we want to say is, how do I maintain these incredibly high standards, but also provide incredibly high supports to make sure students can meet those standards? That's what restorative practices are. It's saying high expectations, high support. So when a student is vaping in the bathroom, we're not going to say, well, that's okay, I'm just going to take this from you and come back tomorrow. We're going to say, vaping's not okay, but I know if you're vaping because you don't feel a sense of belonging, sending you out of our building for 3 days without any support is not going to help. It's just going to make you feel more disengaged and less of a sense of belonging. So what am I going to do? I'm going to hook you up with a Check and Connect mentor. I'm going to get you aligned to do an assessment through our local agency and maybe get you some resources for support. And I'm going to hold you accountable for going through this course, the 6 weeks course for treatment, to make sure that we're addressing the root cause. That would be a restorative approach to that solution. So we're not saying it's okay to do these things. We're not lowering our standard. We're saying, what is the right level of supports to meet the needs of the student instead of just providing a scripted out discipline policy. So how do we operate here? Because I think, and I want to be transparent, we're never going to be here all the time, right? Every single day that we go and show up to work, we're going to be in each one of these spaces multiple times. If I am doing lunch duty in the cafeteria and a fight breaks out, I'm jumping here, right? Like I don't have time to say, oh my gosh, buddy, what's going on, right? We got to get control of the situation and maintain safety. So I'm probably going to operate out of the punitive box in that immediate moment. If I have a colleague who is going through a divorce and is having trouble lining up childcare and they show up to work late a couple days during the week, am I going to say, I'm writing you up? I don't care. The rules are the rules. No, in that situation, I might say, I totally understand. What supports do you need? How can I help? We got to get this right at some point, but I know that you're going through a transition period right now. I might be a little bit more permissive in that space. And so we're going to operate out of all these spaces at different times. In different times, each one is appropriate. But we know that typically this is where we'd want to be. And I think if you're thinking of your person who you said was most influential, if you had to place that person somewhere in this social discipline window, I'm guessing most of you would put them here, right? They believed in you. They had really, really high standards for you. They wanted you to be successful and believed that you could be successful. And when you weren't achieving that, they said, what do you need from me? How can I help? They were there for you. It was unconditional, right? Yeah, you screwed up, but I'm going to be there for you because I know that you can achieve great things. I think that's where we want to be, right? Like the high support, high expectations. So what are the practices that allow us to stay there? So this is the Restorative Practices continuum. And you can see this goes from informal to formal. So the way I think of that is these things right here are things that are happening every single day, every single class period, all the time. Tier 1, right? These are tier 1 practices that we're always doing. As we get further up, we're thinking more tier 2, tier 3 practices require more training, more support, more time, more intensive. So we're going to talk through each of these, but we're really going to focus on these first 3 or 4 because the formal conferencing, really, that's something that mostly it's going to be, building principal, district leadership, doing these. These are pretty serious things, like something really, really bad happened, and it takes a lot of time to prep for that. So the first piece, affective statements. What are those? So they're brief statements about the impact of someone's behavior, usually done in the form of I statements. They encourage people to clearly verbalize how they're feeling in relation to another person's behavior, and they provide feedback, set boundaries, and teach empathy. So our goal is, you can see here, is we want to move from what we call these communication stoppers, because really restorative practices is just rooted in how we communicate. It's an effective communication strategy and skill. How do we communicate with people on a daily basis? So we want to move from communication stoppers to more restorative language. In order to do that, we have to know what are communication stoppers. What are things that are going to give us a high likelihood of not being impactful or being effective in a conversation? Things that are going to probably shut down a conversation rather quickly. And again, no judgment on here because these are things that I do all the time. Please don't ask my wife how many times I use these because it won't be pretty. So first communication stopper, diagnosis. So implying that you know what is right by judging, blaming, or comparing. So when we're talking about students, the problem with that student is they're lazy. The problem with that student is they're disrespectful. Even when we're talking about our colleagues, right? The problem is that with that person is they don't carry their weight. They don't care as much as I do. So we are diagnosing based on our values and beliefs what we think is wrong with somebody else. The second one is demanding, and this is all about power and control. So we see this a lot in traditional systems. I'm going to use my position of authority to get you to do what I want you to do. So if you don't sit down and be quiet, you're going to go to the office. If you don't get to class, you're going to get a detention. I'm using my power, my control, my authority to make somebody do what I want them to do. Denial, and I think this is important. If of all these 4, I think this is the most important because I think this is what we do very often. Is we deny our responsibility of what's going on in a situation. Nobody can make us feel any type of way. We are 100% responsible for our feelings. Anytime that we're feeling a certain way, it's because a need is not being met, and we need to understand that. So Elizabeth, I keep picking on you because you're right up front and you know me, so I feel like I can. But if Elizabeth says something to me, I can't say, Elizabeth, you really pissed me off, right? Like Elizabeth didn't do that. Elizabeth might have treated me in a way where I didn't feel valued, where I didn't feel respected. And so that need of value and respect is missing. So I could say, Elizabeth, when you call me a jerk, I feel like you don't value me and don't respect me, and that really hurts. Could you please talk to me in a different way, right? Like, so I'm naming that. So she can't make me feel that way. That's triggering that feeling, but it's all about how I'm interpreting it and the need that's not being met for me. Did you have a question? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's not fun, right? Not fun at all. And then we have deserved thinking. So believing that certain behaviors deserve punishment or reward, and believing that we are the ones entitled to determine what that is. So he got in a fight, he needs to be suspended. He did this, so this needs to happen. He was disrespectful, he needs to come and apologize to me. So we believe that we have the authority to determine what somebody deserves based on their behavior, whether that's punishment or reward. So what we want to do is we want to move from these communication stoppers to listening in a more empathetic way and responding in a more adaptive way. So some things for us to consider when it comes to that transition of moving away from those communication stoppers is we want to listen with empathy. So listen with your eyes, heart, and ears. So one thing that we might not recognize is 93% of what we communicate is nonverbal. So only 7% of what we're communicating to somebody, only 7% of what you're hearing from me right now are the words that I'm actually speaking. I'm communicating much more through my tone, through my body language, through how fast I'm talking, how animated I am. I'm communicating much more through that than the words that I'm actually speaking. So you think about going back to that example of cafeteria duty. A kid spills their chocolate milk and I come over and I say, hey, you need to clean that chocolate milk up. Now, in my mind, that's pretty benign, right? Like I'm not being aggressive, I'm not doing anything. But if I stop and pause and think, okay, wait, this person's sitting down, I'm standing up, I'm in a position of authority now. The cafeteria is loud, so I have to raise my voice in a way so the student can hear me. So now the student may interpret that I'm yelling at them or being aggressive. All of these things, when I'm just trying to say, hey, can you clean up the chocolate milk? That student might be interpreting it 100% differently because of all of the different body language pieces and tone and volume that I'm using when I'm communicating that. The second piece is when we're trying to move to a more empathetic way of listening is to stand in someone else's shoes and be willing to listen to how they're experiencing things. And so we know that we can have the exact same experience and experience it completely different. So going back to my times of being a science teacher, I very much like to do lab work, group work, movement, station rotations, all those types of things. One of my teaching partners was very much like, you know what, like I like desks in rows. I like to have the calming classical music on. I like students to have, their computers out, their earbuds in, plugging away. Like, so if that teacher came into my room, she'd be like, oh my God, this is like so overwhelming. I'm feeling super anxious. And for me, like that's super motivating, right? Like, because I love, students connecting and interacting in the way, because that's what feels good to me. If I go to that teacher's classroom, she feels safe and in control, where I'm like, oh my God, this is boring. Like I'm falling asleep. And so just because we're experiencing the same thing doesn't mean we're having the same experience. And so if we don't ask somebody what that experience is like for them and being willing to listen and not just minimize that and say, well, it didn't feel like that to me. I didn't think it was like that bad. Or why are you making a big deal out of that? Really trying to listen and understand what that experience was like for them. And then practicing mirroring. So when we hear somebody telling us how they're feeling, how do we reflect back to them what we're hearing? So when somebody says, gosh, I'm so angry because this person never listens to me and I'm just tired of going there, the teacher doesn't care. What I'm hearing you say is you're really frustrated right now because you want to be heard. Am I hearing that right? If we can reflect back to them so they feel validated in what they're experiencing. Some pitfalls that we might make when listening. So multitasking when attempting to listen. So it's really hard to stop and be present, right? When we talked about the very beginning, the very first slide, one of the theoretical pieces of restorative practices is that mindfulness practice, being able to stop, slow down, be in the moment instead of trying to do a million things, even though we have a million things on our plate right now. Thinking what we're going to say while someone else is speaking. That happens to me all the time. And then thinking about how what the speaker is saying is related to our own experience. So, oh yeah, I totally know what you're saying. You know, when this happened to me one time, instead of saying and validating what we're hearing the other person say when they want to be heard, and then judging the speaker. Those are all things that'll you know, sell us short when we're having conversations. Response pitfalls: letting the speaker know whether or not you agree with them, asking them too many probing questions, giving advice, providing interpretations, and relating the speaker's experiences to our own. Now, if you see at the bottom with the asterisks, each one of these things might be exactly what the speaker wants from us, right? These are not inherently bad things. It's not bad to give advice, but I can tell you right now, I always ask my wife, do you just want me to listen right now, or do you want me to give you advice? Because I know what happens if I start giving advice. It's not a smart move. So making sure that when somebody is talking to us, to say, you know, here's what I'm hearing you say. What are you looking for right now? Are you looking for me to kind of ask more questions? Are you looking for me to relate to you? Are you looking for advice? Like, what is it that you want right now? Do you just want to be heard? I have a close friend who does some of our school-based therapy, and she always says, humans don't want to be fixed. Humans want to be heard. And I always have to remind myself that, to pause and stop and just say, this is not my job to fix this problem for this person. It's my job to listen with empathy, try to understand where they're coming from, and ask them what they would like from me in that situation. So how do we do all those things, right? Like, we talked about relationship building and how, you know, we don't have strategies for building relationships. We talked about all these crappy ways of communicating and how they're going to, you know, set us up for failure. What do we do? How do we communicate with students in high intensity situations when two kids got in a fight, when, you know, two kids are they're having conflict with each other, two adults are having conflict with each other? What do we do? So the way that we would make an affective statement is we would always start with an observation. So observation, judgments, two very different things. So an observation is something that I can actually see or I can actually hear. So an observation is not, when I see you being a jerk, that is not an observation, that's a judgment. When I see you being disrespectful, that is not an observation, that's a judgment. An observation is when I hear you call Johnny a jerk, I can actually hear that, right? That is something that I can observe. I can actually hear. That actually came out of their mouth. When I see you running in the hallway, I can actually see that. When I see you throw a pencil at Susie, I can actually see that. So we want to start with an observation, saying what I see when I see or hear, not a judgment. Stay away from the judgments. Then we want to talk about how that makes us feel. So what's the feeling that's triggered when we see that? When I see you running in the hallway, I feel worried. When I see you throw a pencil at Susie, I don't feel safe. What is the feeling that's triggered when we see that? And then what is the need that's missing? So when I see you running in the hallway, I feel worried because it's really important to me that students are safe in our building, right? So I'm saying what I see, connecting it to a feeling, and I'm talking about why I feel that way because what need is missing. And then I'm going to make a request. Would you be willing to? So when I see you running in the hallway, I feel worried because it's really important to me that students are safe. Would you be willing to walk? Now, if you're in elementary right now, you're probably like, yeah, this is cool. I like this. And if you're in high school, you're like, you dummy. I'm not going to talk to an 18-year-old kid like this. But what I will say is, the more that you practice this, the more it becomes natural. So when I am using an affective statement with a 17-year-old student and I come up and I say, hey, I've noticed you've been gone the last 3 days. I was really worried about you. Everything okay? You know, I know your mom's been sick. Is there anything you need to make sure that you get to school on time? I really want you to be successful. That doesn't sound as corny, right? It doesn't sound as scripted. It sounds natural, but I did all those things. I haven't seen you in school in a few days. I'm feeling worried. I really want you to be successful. Is there anything I can do to help you get to class or get to school? So the more we use it, the more natural it becomes, but it is a way that we can help students develop empathy, which we know is sorely lacking. It's a way that we can help adults develop empathy, which is sorely lacking. It's a way for us to communicate without placing blame. So we're not denying responsibility for where we are in this space. We're taking ownership for our feelings and clearly identifying what's needed and then making a request. Because we know we can't make anybody do anything, but we're going to make a request. Has anybody seen the movie The Breakup with Vince Vaughn and Jennifer Aniston? Do you remember the part in it when she asks him for lemons and he doesn't get the lemons and they're fighting in the kitchen, and And she's like, wants him to come and do the dishes. And he's like, I don't want to do the dishes. And then she gets mad and she's like, and then finally he's like, fine, I'll come do the dishes. And she's like, no, never mind. I don't want you to do the dishes because I want you to do the dishes. I want you to want to do the dishes. He's like, why would I want to do the dishes? Now, when I was watching that, I was thinking to myself, man, some I statements would have been great here, right? So what is the need that's missing? Because it wasn't about the dishes, right? It's when I see a sink full of dishes, I feel sad, I feel disrespected, I feel frustrated, because I need us to have an equal partnership. And I want us to both value, having a clean house, or both value each other. Would you be willing to do this, right? So it's a way that we can communicate in a way that's more effective, where it's not just escalating to us screaming at each other. How are we doing on time? 5 minutes? All right. Shit. All right. So let's skip that. So the second part on that continuum of practices would be affective questions. So again, please, if you hear anything today, don't jump into restorative practices and say, we're going to jump straight to solving these big, massive problems. It all starts with communication, right? And if you don't focus on that foundational piece of clarifying, in this space, in our school, in our classroom, in our district, this is how we communicate with each other. This is what effective communication looks like in our space. If you skip over that part and you just start trying to bring kids together to problem solve, that's a skill, right? Like we wouldn't give kids trigonometry without teaching them how to add. We've got to have the foundation. The foundation is communication. And if we don't have that foundation, the bigger pieces are never going to work. So start there. The next piece up though would be affective questions. And these can be consistent. They can be modified a little bit, but I think it's really easy to keep it simple, right? Don't reinvent the wheel. So when we're seeing challenging behavior, when somebody's doing something that doesn't align with our values, being able to ask, what happened? What were you thinking at the time? What have you thought about since? Who's been affected and how? And what do you think you need to do to make things right? What you don't see on there is, why did you do that, right? A lot of times, A, that's very accusatory. And B, a lot of times when students do things, when we talk about shame, nobody can think clearly in a moment of shame. Students don't know why they did it. They responded and they're like, yeah, I probably shouldn't have done that. Giving them an opportunity to reflect, talk about what they were thinking and what triggered that, so they can be more cognizant of that next time. Thinking about who was impacted beyond just, they punched somebody in the cafeteria. Okay, you didn't just impact the person that you punched. You impacted your mom, who had to come up here and have a conversation with the principal. You impacted the other students in the cafeteria who don't feel safe. You impacted your team because you have to sit out a basketball game now and they're counting on you to be present. So having them really think through, again, building that empathy of, when I make this decision, who's impacted in our community? How is our community impacted? And then what do you need to do to make things right? I'm not going to tell you. Let's listen to all the people that you impacted and hear what they need in order to move forward and feel supported. And then let's do that. Victims or bystanders, those who are affected. What did you think when you realized what had happened? What impact has this incident had on you? What's been the hardest thing for you? And what do you think needs to happen to make things right? Think about a time that you harmed somebody intentionally or unintentionally. Think about if you did something in your childhood where you caused harm. What would you rather have? Would you rather go to the principal's office and say, hey, you're going to stay 30 minutes after school with me and do homework? Or would you rather sit in a space, in a circle, with the person that you harmed, the bystanders who observed it, your parents, and hear them say, this is how what you did impacted me. This is why it was really hard for me when this happened. And what do you think needs to happen to make, and this is what I need to happen to make things right? I can tell you right now, I'd take the detention 10 times out of 10, right? That's hard. So when we say restorative practices let kids off the hook, BS. This is hard. Like, I would never want to be in that position. That is really, really hard. So when we do it right, it's super impactful. Am I out of time? No? Okay, good. The last part that we're going to talk about, circles. So circles we can use for community building, or we can use to resolve problems. So circles by nature promote a lot of values that maybe we talked about when we talked about values that are important to us early in the session today. Equality. Right now, we don't have equality in this room. I'm standing up, you're sitting down. Those people in the back, they don't even get a seat. Poor people. I feel bad for you guys. Right? There's no equality. But when we're sitting in a circle, we have equal seating. It's not hierarchical. It's we're all on the same page. We're a community. We talk about equity. There's equity in voice. So we're going to pass this talking piece around. And it's not me standing up here dominating the conversation, talking at you guys like I am right now. It's us saying we've got a problem to solve. And we're going to all work together. And we're all going to equal voice in how we're going to solve this problem together. It promotes safety and trust, responsibility, facilitation, ownership, and connections. One thing that I think we need to recognize, 1 minute, is if we're going to be doing circles, 80% of your circles should be proactive and be focused on community building. So when we think about relationships, I can't take money out of the ATM if I haven't put money in the bank, right? Don't expect a kid to want to solve a problem with you or to repair a relationship that's not already there. So if I haven't sat in a space and built community with you, if I don't value you as a person because I don't think you value me, if there's not trust there and we haven't been vulnerable with each other, then why would I sit in a space after harm has been done and want to repair anything? There's nothing to repair. We don't have a relationship to repair. So 80% of circles should be focused on community building. When we invest in that relationship building, when we have that structure to do that, kids will take the ownership, right? They'll want to repair the harm because they've harmed somebody that's important to them and that they value. I'm going to stop. These are all the other slides, guys. I wish we could spend more time together. I'm sorry. This is my contact. If you have questions, please reach out. I'd love to, willing to set up a phone call, talk through things. If you have questions, shoot me an email. Hey, we're trying this out. Do you have any feedback on how I could set up a circle to address this issue? I'd love to collaborate on these things. See a lot of familiar faces here, but no, please reach out. I'd love to be as helpful as I can if you want to go down this road of doing restorative practices. Thank you very much for being here.